So I'm going to be presenting a bit of oceanographic context developed in the course of this project in support of all the ecological studies that we're hearing about today. So the motivation for this is that, you know, when you're out there, look, this is, by the way, where's Adam? This is, I put this up as an example of an MPA border that would be absolutely ridiculous just for you. The motivation for the Oceanographic Context project, and I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, is that what goes on in here depends very strongly on what's going on way out here. And in fact, if you looked far enough, you know, like Yokohama, Japan, it kind of matters what's going on over there too, just because literally the North Pacific impacts our location, impacts our MPAs and our coastal habitats. And so the motivation here is to synthesize oceanographic information at large scales down to hopefully inform as best we can some of the smaller scale patterns that you all are developing. And so as I just said, we're going to be looking at oceanographic context both in terms of measurements that will speak more strongly to regional or network scale dynamics, things that will be things like here's a relationship between Copepod community structure and salmon production, but kind of these general large-scale production measures. You know, how many fish are born in a given year, what's recruitment like, things like that, how much phytoplankton or nutrients supply kelp there is. You know, and that's going to be driven in part by upwelling. It's going to be driven in part by these large-scale climate modes I'll talk about. But we also wanted to the degree possible to provide information on oceanographic structure at a local scale, particularly those structures that are more consistent, things like fronts and where fronts are located along the coast, because these features have been shown to have impacts on coastal ecosystems. For instance, this is a relationship between the probability of a front being observed at a particular point along the coast. This is actually Southern California. And the abundance of young of the year rockfish. This is a study by Brock Woodson and colleagues. If there's a front near your MPA, you're more likely to have good recruitment than if fronts are rare next to your MPA. So we're trying to develop that range of context or increase information across this gradient. But let me back up and talk about what really drives the California current. When we're talking about MPAs, we may be very interested in a lot of these small-scale features, but when we talk about certainly the MPA network or coastwide network, what's really driving this upwelling-driven California current system are basin-scale climate variability. Things like El Niño, which is measured by the multivariate El Niño index, which strongly influences both atmospheric processes, what's the wind forcing going to be, but also can drive poleward flow, changes in thermocline structure, and cause warming. It's a remote forcing coming from the equator and propagating up the coast, as well as Pacific Decadal Oscillation and the North Pacific Gyre Oscillation, both of which characterize variability in the strength of the flow across the North Pacific and into the California current. So there are indices of how strongly the California current is flowing. If the California current is flowing strongly, it's bringing cold water from the north. It also tends to correspond with strong upwelling, and so it's cool productive conditions. If you were to go to any point along much of this coast and take an ecological time series and want to ask what's really, a long ecological time series certainly, what's really driving variability in that time series, these indices are likely to have high skill because they are governing the broad scale structure and dynamics of the California current. And they will have as good and possibly better skill than a local time series, unless that local time series is a very well tied to one of these. That's just something that's emerged from a lot of research throughout the coast. So, I mentioned the importance of these time series. This is water column structure from the surface down to about 120 meters, right at our station 3 on the Trinidad headline, which is an observational transect off Trinidad Head. These are CTD profiles of temperature, ranging from about 7 degrees up to about 16. And you can see that these events, the 2010 El Nino, we see warming throughout the water column. The warm blob showing up here in 2014, and then the subsequent 2015, 2016 El Nino. Massive warming in the water column. This particular is the marine heat wave that we've all heard about. It came in two phases, the warm blob, then the El Nino, and follow-up things going on. These indices, these climate indices, are actually manifesting in our local waters. Okay? So that's supposed to show. And we're seeing, I'm going to give you first some oceanographic measurements and then talk about the products in what we produced. This is the Trinidad headline where we're going out and doing monthly sampling. These, the marine heat wave that I just showed you, whoops, let's go back, showed you, in 2010 we started seeing a lot more warm water copepod species showing up. When the marine heat wave really hit, the cold water species began to disappear. Okay, we saw pretty substantial ecological, biological, oceanographic changes associated with these climate modes. It also manifested in krill. We had this species Euphausia recurva, which tends to be way out here in the North Pacific, actually coming in with the blob waters and being caught in our coastal transect. And Nyctophanus simplex is normally located down Point Conception. And with the El Nino and the poleward transport associated with storms and the warming water, why do I keep hitting the wrong button? Came up along the coast. So these large-scale transport processes, these large-scale shifts of water masses really had an impact on our region. They also contributed to the harmful algal bloom. I throw this out here not to say very much other than that this was another huge event that happened in 2015. You will notice Trinidad area, this area was a hot spot for domoic acid and for the pseudonychia cells that produce that domoic acid. And it really was off the charts in our area. Rafe Kudela, I've mentioned this at past talks on this, refers to our little area between the Cape Blanco and Mendocino as a cauldron. We also had pretty high DA levels in 2014, even though it wasn't part of this massive, it's an interesting area here. Bottom line, baseline study period, when all these ecological studies were being conducted, really was unusual in terms of what the ocean was doing. We had this heat wave come in. This was not your typical, just even a typical El Nino, not that there is a typical El Nino, but typical El Nino and relaxation cycle. This was like this sustained, very unusual, unprecedentedly high, unprecedentedly strong warm anomalies. It's not clear yet whether these years were just blips and we're going to kind of go back to something that we're more accustomed to, or whether this is kind of a shift to a new regime. So that's to be determined. So if you want to know more, there is a report coming soon to a website near you. Whenever we get our revisions done, there aren't many to do, thank God. But now I want to go through what's in this report, so just to give you kind of an intro to what's going to be available. One of the products that we have is the Multivariate Ocean Conditions Index. This was developed by Marisol Garcia-Reyes and Bill Seidemann. It's a regional index in that it's not something derived from these large-scale, basically, synthesized sea surface temperature patterns over the North Pacific kind of indices. But what it does is it takes indices like the El Nino Index and PDO and MPVO, blends them with measurements of sea level anomaly, wind forcing, sea surface temperature, and things like that, in particular regions, through a PCA process and statistical combination, to characterize seasonal anomalies. In other words, comparing among springs. Is a particular spring warmer, cooler, less productive, more productive than other springs in the time series? And it does a nice job capturing the marine heat wave, the 2010 El Nino, the massive El Nino of 97, 98. Now these time series are long time series. Okay, they have to go back to at least, I believe, 1991 and be continuous on up through here. So there is a question of whether you could develop MOSI for a specific MPA. Well, if you have 20 years of environmental data, yes. Otherwise, no. But these do capture also some regional variability. For instance, it's the marine heat wave seems to be a little bit stronger or have a little bit more profound effect, and an ongoing effect here north of Mendocino. That's the cutoff is right about there. than south of Mendocino, and that may have to do with where atmospheric structures are sitting. Some other things that we put together in the report, we used measurements of ocean currents from high-frequency radar, the coastal network, as well as satellite altimetry. You measure variability in height of the ocean surface. You can infer the currents that are flowing around. It's like high-pressure, low-pressure systems in the atmosphere. And what we noticed in this is that the baseline study period had two coast-wide, very strong periods of unusually poleward flow. In other words, the storm structure, the fact that the sea level anomaly was positive, there was a tendency for poleward flow along the coast. Hopkins Rose nudibranchs showing up way north. That's an example of what could happen with the transport of the various plankton taxa that I was talking about. Again, highly unusual. It happens, something like this happens typically with very, very strong El Niños, but not usually 2 years in a row. Some other things that we did is we looked at sea surface temperature data. We compiled the information, extracted it from sea surface temperature records, remote sensing along the coast. We also did a couple of calculations on this to begin to look at that spatial structure question. One is just simply calculating the gradient. Wherever you see a sharp gradient here, that's likely to be a front. And there's a new analysis recently out by Nieto et al., where it's a little bit more of you take the sea surface temperatures within a little box and you look for two modes of sea surface temperatures by doing a histogram. And, excuse me, if you find two modes, those are two distinct water masses, and you ask where's the division there, you call that the front. And then you have you basically move a window back and forth doing that. And you see you get a much cleaner picture of the fronts. So we compile both just an average gradient, what's the ocean kind of look like, as well as this front index, and we provide time series, seasonal climatologies, et cetera, like that. So you can look for things like persistent structure. Is there usually a front here coming off Blanco or off Mendocino or things like that? Distill it into things like this. This is mean sea surface temperature by month over 1990 something to 2013, by latitude and by month. You see that it's usually colder, regardless of season, here in the vicinity of Cape Mendocino. There's usually some fronts north of Mendocino, south of Mendocino, in the vicinity of Point St. George. And then this is chlorophyll, corresponding chlorophyll. Less chlorophyll near the coast, near Mendocino. Why? Because that's where the upwelling's strongest, and the chlorophyll that does get produced is further offshore. We can look at anomalies for this to kind of really show you this is the mean, and then this is how much warmer or cooler it was than by month. We see the warm blob and the El Niño signals came in, and they spanned the entire north coast region. Okay. What we also notice, I don't show the pictures here, is because these are so coherent, those frontal structures, those patterns of where it was warmer to the north or cooler to the south, those are actually fairly persistent, and that's not surprising because they're tied into the topography of the coast. So those are persistent structures regardless of how much warmer or cooler it happens to be. It doesn't have much to do with the ocean except when it goes into the ocean, but river discharge, we did compile the data for this so that the folks with estuaries or nearshore habitats that might be affected by variability in freshwater discharge have that data available. And we also looked at developed a very simple index of where along the coast freshwater inputs are likely to be important over the course of a year. Basically in terms of, this is going to have some impact on coastal oceanographic structure, so how will that help us differentiate habitats along the coast? And so one of the new things, not only are we able to look at MPAs and say, well, are you near a front, away from a front, those kind of things, but we wanted to complement the information that was available in design of MPAs in terms of where is rocky habitat, where is sandy habitat, things like that, in terms of a richer characterization of the oceanographic habitat. And so we would take latitudinal strips of sea surface temperature, the front index chlorophyll, sea level anomalies, some current measurements, proximity to watersheds, and we used what's called k-means analysis. It's a way of looking for breaks breaks in the distribution of a matrix of environmental information, or any other information for that matter. And when we got into this range of 6 to 8 breaks, that's about where the explained variance began to level off. And you can see there are actually regions of the coast, some that are influenced by the rivers. There's another river. Some that are influenced by, being in the vicinity of major headlands. Again, this is greater river influence down here, things like that. And this is the kind of information, these patterns, I wanted to mention, these patterns are fairly robust over the course of a year and across years. And we characterize that all in the report. But this is really important information if you want to know whether your reference site is oceanographically similar to your MPA sites. So this is the kind of information that admittedly would have been nice to have before we ever designed a lot of these studies. I hope it doesn't compromise anything. We're about 5 minutes. Oh, I'm good then. Because I'm here to the bottom line again. Baseline study spans some highly unusual ocean conditions. We had, again, these warm anomalies that were coast-wide. They did not seem to disrupt kind of the consistent or persistent spatial structure in the coastal ocean. We saw these warm anomalies, we had both that onshore propagation of warm blob water, but also strong poleward, anomalously poleward in terms of weaker than normal equatorward flow, as well as direct, early in the season, poleward flow along the coast that could have caused, brought warmer waters, but also could have caused unusual transport of anything with planktonic larvae. And this is corroborated by the observations that we saw in terms of changes in the Copepod community and the Euphausiid community. So we know that plankton were moved by this stuff, by these dynamics. And you can think about that in terms of the larvae of the critters that you are all interested in. We're not sure whether the baseline study is really a baseline study for what we're going to be going into, or if it was something that was really highly unusual and not to be repeated anytime soon. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So we know it was crazy anomalous, right, during the collection of this data. Mm-hmm. But given this, the state is mandated to essentially monitor MPA effects or change over time. And so regardless of the fact that when that baseline was collected was really anomalous, what's your thought about us, our ability to detect change moving forward? So the baseline might not be representative of what was historic, but can we detect change given that the baseline was collected during this really anomalous period?
Assuming that the effect of MPAs is due to the actual protection, the removal of harvest or constraints on harvest, in theory, yes, you should be able to detect these things. So long as, and this is a caveat to that, so long as the inside and outside comparisons are being coherently driven, or nearly coherently driven by the oceanography. If you, and what's nice is we did see those coherent responses. Okay, so like it got warmer everywhere, it got cooler everywhere. So some of that's going to be fine. Where I think there needs to be some caution, and this is where I think some of the integration work should go on, is if you have an MPA that's like sitting right on a, or has a lot of front activity or proximity next to it, and your reference site is far enough away that it's not as strongly affected. You could have differences in recruitment or other structuring processes. And so one of them is, to take that one step further, the persistent oceanographic structure seemed not to be affected by these climate events. So that should be something you can control for, despite the unusual nature of these years. Knock on wood, caveats, grains of salt.
Yeah, if you go to Southern California 2014, 2015, they had your albacore, they have your yellowfin, and they have bluefin, and it actually caused a 20-year spike in fishing licenses. But if you just ran correlations without sort of mindless correlations, there also was a temperature increase, and that seemed to drive people wanting to buy it, maybe to get away from the heat, may not even be the ocean. But it raises the issue, how much do you think the ocean is being affected by this very slow, by the temperatures we're seeing?
Well, I mean, temperature is one of the more profound influences on ocean ecosystems. And a lot of what you're talking about, especially Southern California, there was a push. I didn't mention it, but in 2014, we thought the mother of all El Niños was coming, and then it stalled out. You can actually still see a signal, a poleward signal in temperature anomalies coming up with that. So it's kind of like this staged wave El Niño that happened in the south. They call it blobito down there because it was a small blob. But yeah, and it brought in those unusual species, the flat spread crabs, the whole nine yards. So I'll be around, so.
Yeah, thanks, Eric.